My grandfather had one rule growing up in Puerto Rico. Never go into the woods after sundown. My grandfather only had one rule when I was growing up in Puerto Rico. Never go into the woods after sundown. He said it all the time. But he never explained why. At the time, I assumed it was just one of those old rural superstitions. I didn't realize until I was 14 that he meant it very seriously. I grew up in Fajardo, a beach town on the eastern side of Puerto Rico. Most people think about the ocean when they hear that name. Boats, fishing docks, ferries heading to the smaller islands. But if you actually grow up there, you learn pretty quickly that the ocean isn't the only thing surrounding the town. Behind the neighborhoods and houses, the land turns into thick forest and hills. The woods start just past the last row of houses. Once you get into them, the trees grow close together, the ground becomes uneven, and once the sun goes down, it gets dark in a way that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. I lived with my dad growing up, but my grandparents were our next door neighbors, so I spent a lot of time at their house whenever my dad was working. That meant my grandfather was around almost every day of my life. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to believe in anything supernatural. When he was younger, he had been around 6'3", though by the time I knew him, old age had brought him closer to 6 feet. He was still broad-shouldered and imposing, the kind of man who looked like he had spent his entire life doing hard work. He served in the U.S. Army for about a decade, starting in the late 1940s, and after leaving the service, he worked a number of jobs before eventually opening a small bodega in New York during the 1970s. Later, he moved back to Puerto Rico. He wasn't superstitious, which is why the rule always felt strange. Every evening, he would sit on the balcony in a long blue and white hospital chair he had because of circulation problems in his legs. From there, he could see the street and the houses across from us. The woods were behind the houses, out of view, still. Almost every day at some point, he would repeat the same warning. Never go into the woods after sundown, never explained why. One evening when I was about 14, one of my best friends came over. The sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. The sky had that deep orange color that tells you night is coming soon. He asked if we could go explore, and he meant the woods. Normally, I would have asked my grandfather if it was okay, but that time I did in single quotes I knew what he would say. So instead, I just told him we were going out for a walk. As we were leaving through the gate, he called out to me from the balcony, "Don't go into the woods after sundown." Words caught me off guard. I hadn't said anything about the woods. For a moment, I wondered if he somehow knew. I laughed it off and said we wouldn't, but the warning stayed in the back of my mind. We went into the woods. Anyway, at first everything felt normal. We followed one of the trails we had walked plenty of times before. The coqui frogs were chirping and the trees moved gently with the evening breeze. Eventually, the light faded until moonlight was the only thing lighting the path. After a while, my friend said he needed to take a leak, so he stepped off the trail and walked a little deeper between the trees. I waited. 1 minute passed, then another, then a few more. Something about the woods suddenly felt different. Quieter. Too quiet. So I stepped off the trail and went looking for him. Instead of finding him, I walked straight into a clearing. At first, I thought I recognized it. There was a small open spot in the woods where one of the neighbors had thrown a party once when I was younger. I remembered music, people drinking, a fire pit in the middle. But something about this clearing didn't feel right. The one I remembered was small, maybe 20 feet across at most. This one was much bigger. The tree line stretched farther out than I remembered, forming a wide circle around me. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow walked to a completely different place, but I didn't remember there being any other clearings nearby, and standing in the middle of it was a figure. At first, I thought it was my friend, so I called his name. No response. I walked farther out of the trees, thinking maybe he just couldn't hear me. By the time I realized something was wrong, I was already deep in the clearing. The figure slowly turned around, and suddenly I realized I was less than 10 feet away. It wasn't my friend. It was an old woman. From the edge of the clearing, she had looked tall, but up close she looked small and frail. Her skin was pale, and her hair was white as snow, hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her expression is something I still struggle to describe. The best way I can explain it is this: she looked angry. Not normal anger. Something deeper. Something that made her face look almost possessed. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then she lifted her hands. The way she moved them didn't look normal. They moved too fast, too sharply for someone who looked that old. Almost like her body didn't match the way she was moving. She started murmuring something under her breath. I couldn't understand the words. At the same time, the wind suddenly picked up around the clearing. not a breeze, a sudden rush of air that pushed through the trees and made the branches bend. Then the temperature dropped. Anyone who has been to Puerto Rico knows how strange that is, even at night. The air is warm. But suddenly the cold hit my chest when I breath. The wind got stronger. The trees around the clearing started swaying, and the entire time she kept moving her hands in the air, murmuring something I couldn't understand. Fear completely took over. I shut my eyes and braced myself for something to happen, but after a few seconds, everything stopped. The wind died instantly. The cold disappeared. The sounds of the forest slowly returned. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. She was gone. It took almost an hour before my friend and I finally found each other again. According to him, he had never moved from the spot where he stepped off the trail. He said one minute I was standing there, and the next minute I was gone. We walked out of the woods quickly. The entire time it felt as if something was watching us from between the trees, but the moment we stepped out under the streetlights, that feeling disappeared. When I got home, my grandfather was still on the balcony. At first he looked angry that I had stayed out so late, but the moment he saw my face, his expression changed. "You're pale, what happened?" he asked. I told him everything. When I finished, he slowly turned and looked toward the dark line of houses that stood between us and the woods. For the first time in my life, that big, tough man looked pale. Finally he spoke. "Brujahs, witches." He immediately went inside and started closing the windows, every single one. Then he locked the doors. That wasn't something he normally did, not like that. Before I left for my house next door, I looked back through the doorway. My grandfather was sitting alone in the living room. And for the first time in a long time, I saw him praying the rosary. After that night, we never talked about what happened in the woods again, and he never repeated the rule. He didn't have to, because from that night on, I understood exactly why he said it. Some places change after the sun goes down. And whatever I saw that night is the reason I will never go into the woods after sundown again.